Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS BNB Full Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The Forrester Manse had always been a symbol of permanence, a place where power, fashion and family history intermingled into one assessing structure perched above Los Angeles. Its walls had absorbed decades of triumphs and backstabbings, rapprochements and dolor. On this particular evening, the house was quiet in the way only old homes could be, deceptively calm, holding its breath before desolation struck. Eric Forrester moved sluggishly through the corridor, his steps softened by the thick hairpieces that had been imported decades before, his studies heavy with the weight of heritage. Age had braked his body, but his mind remained sharp, especially when it came to the family he'd erected and the conglomerate that bore his name. Eric hadn't intended to listen in. That had no way been his way. Yet fate, as it so frequently did in the Forrester family, placed him exactly where he demanded to be to hear what would change everything. As he broke near the living room entrance, incompletely hidden by a marble column and an antique form, the low, critical voices of Ridge and Brooke drifted through the open space. Their tones were hushed but violent, the kind reserved for secrets too dangerous to be spoken audibly. Eric stood still, artificially knowing that interposing this moment would burglarize him of a verity he wasn't meant to ignore. What Eric eavesdropped struck him like a slow-burning explosion. Ridge and Brooke were bound together by a secret far deeper than another revivified love or a familiar treason. This was calculated, strategic. It involved control of Forrester creations, opinions formerly made behind unrestricted doors, and an unborn Eric had no way agreed to. The company he'd erected from nothing, the heritage he'd intended to pass on with honor, had come a log-rolling chip in a private arrangement fueled by fear, ambition and undetermined desire. Brooke's influence, subtle but inarguable, floated over every word Ridge spoke, while Ridge's certainty revealed how far he'd formerly gone down a path that barred his father entirely. Eric's heart pounded, not with rage alone, but with profound disappointment. He'd always known Ridge carried his own vision for Forrester creations, but this was different. This was secretiveness embedded in deception. The consummation that opinions were being made without him, about him, cut deeper than any treason Eric had endured ahead. He remained frozen in place, hearkening as the pieces fell together, as the verity revealed itself subcast by subcast. By the time their voices faded and steps moved down, Eric Forrester was no longer the same man who had walked down that hallway moments before. He retreated to his study in silence, closing the heavy rustic doors behind him as though sealing down the man he used to be. The room smelled noiselessly of leather, old books, and the moping presence of Stephanie Forrester, whose portrayal still commanded respect from the far wall. Eric lowered himself into his president, his hands pulsing, not from weakness, but from the magnitude of the decision forming in his mind. He goggled at the Forrester crest engraved into his office, the symbol of everything he'd offered to make, and eventually understood that guarding his heritage might bear destroying the vision of harmony he'd spent times conserving. For decades Eric had forgiven. He'd looked the other way. He'd allowed love, fidelity, and blood ties to reason jest. That would have ended any other cooperation. But what he eavesdropped crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't about Brooke versus Taylor, or Ridge's incapability to choose. This was about respect, authority, and the slow erasure of Eric's part as primogenitor. In that moment, he accepted a painful verity: the Forrester Manse was no longer united under one vision, and pretending else would only quicken its collapse. The coming morning the house felt different. Wordless pressure strained into every corner. The staff tasted it. The air itself sounded heavier, as though the walls flashed back the secret Eric now carried. When the family gathered latterly that day, they were unrehearsed for the shift in Eric's address. He was calm, unnervingly so. There was no wrathfulness in his eyes, no pulsing in his voice. Rather, there was resoluteness. The kind that comes only after treason has been completely reused and accepted. Eric's shocking decision unfolded not in a moment of rage, but with surgical perfection. He began by reclaiming control fairly, intimately, and symbolically. Documents were reviewed. Authority was clarified. Long-standing hypotheticals were challenged. Ridge, so habituated to operating as the unquestioned future of Forrester Creations, suddenly set up himself facing a reality where his father was no longer willing to fade still into the background. Brooke, ever confident in her place within the family and the company, tasted the shift too late to stop it. The manse itself sounded to echo with the impact of Eric's choice, as though every chandelier and staircase understood that the balance of power had changed. But Eric's decision went beyond business. It struck at the heart of the family dynamic. By drawing a line, he forced everyone to choose a side. Not between suckers, but between translucency and manipulation. Long-buried resentments resurfaced. Old alliances cracked. The Forrester name, once a unifying force, came a glass reflecting each character's true provocations. Eric didn't raise his voice. He didn't hang. His strength lay in clarity, and that clarity was ruinous. As the verity gurgled through the manse, connections fractured under its weight. Ridge plotted with the consequences of undervaluing his father. Brooke faced the uncomfortable consummation that her influence, once her topmost armament, had eventually provoked unrecoverable fallout. The youngest generation watched nearly, understanding that the puck tale of unconditional remission had officially ended. This was a reckoning decades in the timber. By evening, Eric stood alone on the sundeck, gaping out over the megacity he'd conquered with vision and determination. The lights below glistered like the once beautiful, distant, and insolvable to reclaim. He knew the fallout would be brutal. He knew the family would no way be the same. Yet for the first time in a long while, Eric Forrester felt at peace. He'd chosen verity over comfort, heritage over sentiment, and leadership over silence. The Forrester manse still stood altitudinous, but its foundation had shifted ever. And as dawn approached, one thing was certain: nothing in the world of the bold and the beautiful would ever be the same again. The days following Eric Forrester's decision unfolded like a slow, grim earthquake. Nothing collapsed all at formerly. Rather, hairline fractures appeared far and wide. Exchanges cut short, ganders held too long, doors closed with just a little further force than necessary. The Forrester manse, formerly alive with controlled chaos and creative energy, came a place of quiet computation. Every family member tasted that the rules had changed, indeed if they didn't yet understand how deeply the consequences would reach. Eric remained deliberate in his movements, rising beforehand each morning, reclaiming habits he'd still surrendered over the times. He walked through the manse with renewed authority, not to blackjack but to remind everyone, including himself, that this house had been erected on his vision. His presence alone altered the atmosphere. Where formerly Ridge had moved freely, assuming his ineluctability, there was now vacillation. Where Brooke had spoken confidently of the future, there was now query moping beneath her countenance. Forrester Creations felt the shift nearly incontinently. Meetings came more formal, less forgiving. Opinions that formerly sailed through on character alone were suddenly scanned. Eric's asseveration on translucency exposed fault lines that had been buried beneath times of assumed trust. Directors who had aligned themselves with Ridge's quiet restructuring plans set up themselves, redefining commitment, not out of fear but survival. The company was no longer drifting toward a future decided behind unrestricted doors. It was being pulled back strongly into the light. The manse itself sounded to repel the new reality. Hallways echoed with recollections of louder days, when horselaugh and arguments blended into the familiar meter of a family that believed it could survive anything. But now the silence was sharper, heavier. Pictures of once generations looked down like substantiations to a trial no bone had anticipated. Stephanie's presence felt stronger than ever, as though her absence had eventually made room for verity rather than nostalgia. Ridge plotted in ways he'd no way anticipated. For the first time, his confidence came a liability rather than a guard. He'd always believed his father would ultimately step away, not because he was pushed, but because time itself would demand it. What Ridge had failed to regard for was Eric's turndown to come inapplicable. The consummation that his father had eavesdropped everything, the planning, the hypotheticals, the quiet certainty that Eric's period was ending, cut deeper than any battle ever could. Brooke, too, felt the ground shifting beneath her. Her part within the Forrester family had always been complicated, shaped by love, contest, adaptability, and survival. She had believed that her cooperation with Ridge, both particular and professional, was a stabilizing force. Now she was forced to defy the possibility that her influence had crossed a line, from probative to invasive, from passionate to strategic. The manse no longer ate her with the same warmth. It didn't reject her outright, but it no longer fraudulent around her presence. The youngest generation watched nearly absorbing assignments no bone had intended to educate. They saw that power didn't always pass naturally from parent to child. That heritage wasn't guaranteed by blood alone. That silence could be more destructive than treason when allowed to mold. The Forrester name, formerly worn like armor, now felt like a responsibility heavier than any of them had anticipated to carry. Eric's decision continued to ripple outward, affecting connections far beyond Ridge and Brooke. Old resentments resurfaced among siblings and consorts who had long pretended to move on. Once negotiations were redefined under a harsher light. The idea of consanity, so frequently sermonized, so infrequently rehearsed, was eventually exposed as fragile, tentative, and deeply dependent on honesty. At night, Eric frequently set up himself awake, gaping out at the megacity lights from the same sundeck where he'd stood after eavesdropping the secret that changed everything. He didn't lament his choice. Remorse belonged to the history, to moments when he'd remained silent for the sake of peace. This time he'd chosen dislocation. And dislocation, he understood, was the only path toward commodity real. The Forrester manse began to reflect its shattered occupants. Apartments formerly filled with warmth felt colder. Shared spaces came homes rather than gathering points. Every commerce carried subtext. Every smile felt measured. Indeed, fests lost their ease, overshadowed by the mindfulness that nothing was guaranteed presently. Not love, not fidelity, not heritage. Eric's health, long rumored about but infrequently addressed openly, came another turnabout of pressure. Some questioned whether his renewed authority was fueled by fear of mortality. Others honored it for what it truly was: clarity. When time feels limited, visions come intolerable. Eric was no longer interested in conserving comfort at the cost of truth, however it would do so actually, or not at each, if the family was to survive. The ultimate impact of Eric's decision came insolvable to ignore when it reached beyond the manse and into the public perception of the Forrester conglomerate. Tales of internal conflict circulated through the fashion world. Investors noticed the shift. Rivals watched nearly, seeing occasion in what appeared to be insecurity. Yet beneath the face, Forrester Creations was getting commodity it hadn't been in times: purposeful, predicated, realigned with its original purpose. And still the emotional costs continued to rise. Love stories strained under the weight of responsibility. Long-standing alliances atrophied when forced into the open. Characters who had formerly thrived in chaos now set up themselves exposed, doubtful how to operate without manipulation as a safety net. The manse didn't explode overnight. It cracked, sluggishly and relentlessly, until every person outside was forced to defy who they truly were when heritage could no longer cover them. By the time the dust began to settle, one verity stood imperturbable: Eric Forrester hadn't destroyed his family. He'd removed the vision holding it together. And in doing so, he assured that whatever rose from the fate, whether conciliation or ruin, would be erected on commodity real. The Forrester manse still stood against the Los Angeles skyline, elegant and imposing as ever. But outside it had been ever changed. Not by reproach alone, but by a primogenitor who eventually chose to hear, to act, and to reclaim his place not as a relic of the history, but as the final authority on a heritage that was no way meant to be inherited still. As weeks passed, the consequences of Eric Forrester's choice grew heavier, more stifling, as though time itself had braked to force everyone inside the manse to sit with the verity. The family could no longer pretend that this was just another temporary fracture, another storm that would pass. Formerly feelings cooled. This was structural, the kind of damage that rewrote connections permanently. The Forrester manse came less a home and further a living library of undetermined pain, where every corridor carried echoes of opinions made too late and trust broken too deeply to repair with justifications alone. Ridge's struggle boosted as the reality of relegation settled in. For times, his authority was in a strange limbo, both assumed and unchallenged. He'd worked as the future while his father still remained the present. Eric's turn down to step away shattered that vision, forcing Ridge to defy the uncomfortable verity that his leadership had no way been officially earned, only gradationally absorbed. The weight of that consummation eroded his certainty, replacing confidence with guard, creativity with computation. The man who formerly thrived on instinct now set up himself alternate, guessing every move, apprehensive that heritage alone was no longer enough to secure his place. Brooke's position came decreasingly insulated. Though she remained collected, her internal reckoning was grim. She had always believed herself to be a stabilizing force in Ridge's life, a voice of reason amid emotional chaos. Now she questioned whether her involvement had crossed from support into influence, from cooperation into unity. The consummation that Eric viewed her not as family, but as a catalyst for deception, settled heavily on her shoulders. She couldn't escape the sense that the manse itself had turned against her, responding to her presence with cold impartiality rather than acceptance. The Forrester children, those raised under the shadow of the dynasty, absorbed the fallout else. Some replied with fear, others with resentment, and many with clarity. They saw that power within the family was neither endless nor defended. That silence, when chosen constantly, ultimately becomes treason. The myth of unconditional fidelity dissolved as they watched their elders unravel under the pressure of responsibility. For them, Eric's stage wasn't simply about control, it was an assignment in consequence. Meanwhile, Forrester Creations entered a period of violent recalibration. Long-standing hypotheticals were disassembled. Opinions formerly driven by emotional constancy were replaced with deliberate evaluation. The company's culture shifted subtly but unmistakably, leaning down from favoritism and toward merit. Some directors defied, uncomfortable with the loss of pungency. Others thrived, relieved to operate within easily defined boundaries. The metamorphosis was neither smooth nor gentle, but it was incontrovertibly effective. For the first time in times, the brand felt aligned with the values it claimed to represent. Eric's health remained a silent presence in every room. Though infrequently bandied openly, it told comprehensions and responses. Some viewed his renewed authority as a final assertion, a man contending against time to secure his heritage. Others honored it as commodity more profound, a turn down to allow the end of life to be defined by concession and remorse. Eric himself felt no urgency to justify his conduct. He'd formerly made peace with the possibility that his choices would bring him connections he formerly held dear. Preservation of verity, he believed, signified further than comfort. The emotional strain within the manse reached a breaking point during moments that should have fostered consanity. Gatherings formerly filled with warmth came exercises in restraint. Grins were careful. Exchanges were guarded. Every commerce carried the mindfulness that trust, formerly broken, doesn't regenerate fluently. Indeed, participated recollections came dangerous home, able of kindling old injuries rather than healing them. Ridge's internal conflict ultimately manifested as distance. Not physical absence but emotional pullout. He remained present, involved, engaged, yet unnaturally disconnected. The man who formerly defined himself through family and heritage now questioned whether either truly belonged to him. His resentment toward Eric battled constantly with guilt, producing a palsy that stifled his creativity and fractured his sense of identity. He couldn't move forward without admitting his father's authority, yet doing so felt like rendition. Brooke, too, faced a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. She understood that remaining silent was no longer an option, yet speaking openly risked attesting every fear Eric had about her influence. She stood at a crossroads, forced to defy whether her place within the Forrester world was embedded in love or influence. The answer, formerly assuring in its nebulosity, now demanded painful clarity. As pressures escalated, the Forrester manse itself sounded to absorb the emotional weight of its occupants. Spaces formerly associated with closeness came monuments of division. The grand staircase no longer represented consanity but scale. The dining room, once a place of connection, now felt like neutral ground where everyone measured their words precisely. The house hadn't changed, yet everything about it felt strange. Eric remained loyal. His resoluteness didn't waver. Indeed, as the cost came decreasingly apparent, he understood that leadership frequently requires enduring insulation, especially when it challenges deeply hardwired patterns. He wasn't seeking conciliation through conciliation. He was seeking metamorphosis through honesty. Whether the family would follow remained uncertain. The fashion world continued to watch nearly. Enterprise boosted as rumors of internal conflicts circulated.